We now live in a day and age where autofocus and anamorphic could potentially belong in the same sentence. From Sirui here with their 40mm T1.8 and Blazar with their 50mm Apex lens. But if I'm being completely honest, this might be the worst autofocus anamorphic lens that there will ever be. Let me explain. What's up, nerds? Welcome back to the channel. Now, I know that line is shocking and a little clickbaity. What I meant by that is, in a way, this lens is the first of its kind, meaning that hopefully it will only get better from here, which makes me very hopeful because even though this lens does have some great features about it, in my testing, I ran into a fair amount of issues that make me question whether or not I can recommend anyone purchase this lens for its autofocus performance. Now, quick disclaimer, Sirui did send me this lens to check out a little over a month ago, but nobody changed hands and they don't get any input or review on this video's creation. Now, this is not going to be a review of this lens, but more of a first impressions overview, given that I haven't had this very long. I've only had it for about a month. Now, to get started, this lens comes in a nice soft padded case. It is a 40mm lens, a full frame 42mm field of view equivalent. So this is a lens rated for super 35 sensors, but it does cover full frame. I'll talk about that in a second. Now, it's a T1.8 aperture and a 1.33 times D squeeze. This lens is also available in a blue and neutral flare. In my testing, I've been using the blue flare model. Now, build quality and design with this lens is a sleek black finish with some blue accents. It's got a manual aperture cine gear ring, as well as a manual cine gear focus ring. There's a D-click switch, an AF/MF switch, and an AFL button. The front of the lens is a 77mm filter thread, and the outer diameter is 80mm for matte boxes. There's also a USB-C port on the back for updates, which is crucial to some of the hopeful feedback that I have with this lens. This lens is available in Sony E-mount, X-mount, Z-mount, and Micro Four Thirds mount. Like I mentioned before, it's rated for Super 35 sensors, but it does cover full frame with minimal vignetting. So a fair amount of my testing is not just with my Sony FX30, but also my Sony a7 IV. And as far as pricing goes, this lens is $799 US. Now, I know that you're all very interested in the main feature of this lens, which is autofocus, but I want to quickly go over where I think this lens stands out, and that's in its image quality. With anamorphic lenses, I'm not focusing on if this lens is technically perfect, but I will be considering whether or not it has anamorphic qualities and the overall look of the image. No pixel peeping here. In my testing, I noticed minimal distortion in Super 35. Does seem to be a little bit more prominent in full frame. It's a pincushion distortion when you do see it, which is pretty typical of Surui's anamorphic lenses. It looks nice, but I would have liked more of a barrel distortion, and I would have liked more distortion to emphasize the anamorphic look just a little bit more. But that may just be a personal preference, so take that with a grain of salt. As far as the flaring goes on this lens, I have the blue flare model, and the flare does happen, but it's not nearly as harsh as some of their previous anamorphic lenses. Opinions on flaring with anamorphic can be pretty subjective, but it is nice to see that they've toned down the flare just a little bit compared to their other anamorphics. In my opinion, I think the flaring on this lens looks really nice. It's a subtle level of intensity, but is there enough to notice it. On full frame, you will see this big circle appear when flaring is in the center of the frame. It could be a cool creative choice, but it could also be distracting depending on how you want to look at it. Now, as far as sharpness goes, a lot of people complained about the softness of the T1.8 on this lens, but I think this lens looks very usable all the way open. Yeah, it's not the sharpest T1.8 out there, but again, we're not pixel peeping. And in my opinion, it's sharp enough that you could use it in a variety of scenarios. In fact, that's where most of my testing was. Now, sharpness does improve a little bit, somewhere between T2.2 and 2.8, but I've really enjoyed using the T1.8 in all my testing. On top of that, chromatic aberration and sharpness get even better around T4. Now, the bokeh is where this lens starts to confuse me a little bit. It's somewhat of a hexagon or trapezoid shape that features a fair amount of green chromatic aberration wide open. There is a little bit of that anamorphic oval look, but not nearly as much as I would have liked to see from this lens. And I can't decide whether or not I actually like the hexagon look. And I'm not even sure how this actually happens because this lens is an 11 bladed aperture. It's got to be something with the anamorphic D-squeeze elements in the lens. And again, I can't decide whether or not I'm okay with this look, but I think I'm leaning towards not liking it. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Overall, I think this lens has a very pleasing image, but it does lack some of the anamorphic characteristics that Surui's other lenses tend to have. I think if you were to crop in from the widescreen D-squeezed look, you'd probably have a hard time noticing whether or not it's a spherical lens or an anamorphic lens. At least that's just my personal preference. I definitely love the emphasized anamorphic characteristics that come from like Blazar lenses or Kawai anamorphics. But again, with this lens, I feel like it's just lacking enough that it could be seen as a spherical lens rather than anamorphic. It's still a really nice image though. All right, to get the elephant out of the room, the main feature of this lens, aside from the anamorphic, is autofocus. Now, for almost a century of anamorphic lenses existing, this is the start of anamorphic and autofocus being put in the same sentence. And I believe that taboo could have been for good reason. You see, anamorphic for a long time was a huge reach for young filmmakers and creators due to those lenses being extremely expensive and limited to the feature film industry. But for the last decade or so, these lenses have been popping up at an affordable price for chumps like you and me, in which Sirui has been a big player in creating affordable anamorphic lenses, as well as Blazar, which I've been very much looking into getting a set of those lenses. But I think that the reason autofocus on these lenses has been such a big reach is because, one, anamorphic lenses were made for feature films, big production industries. And I think nobody ever really asked for them to have autofocus and focused more on the look that these lenses actually produced, which would absolutely make sense, right? Two is because the elements that are inside of anamorphic lenses that make them, well, anamorphic, those elements, in my very uneducated opinion, put extreme stress and strain on any type of autofocus system, which brings up a huge concern in focus consistency. Now, the autofocus does work well in single subject tracking environments. It locks on the subject, and I'd say is about 95% of the time consistent. This lens is a focus by wire or a stepping STM system versus a linear autofocus system. Now, as far as I know, STM systems are much more affordable to manufacture and are typically found in budget lenses. STM motors have been what Sirui has been using on all of their recent autofocus lenses, and it can cause some issues while using the lens. The manual focus, instead of it being mechanical, is electronic, meaning your focus pulls won't be consistent and you have to rely on the camera providing power to the lens for it to even function. I am very aware that a concert is a struggle for autofocus in the first place. The day I received this lens, I brought it to a concert and it really struggled to keep anything in focus. Even at one point, the lens just completely stopped working and I had to disconnect the lens, reattach it, and reboot my camera. And again, that could be due to the harsh lighting conditions of the concert venue. But on top of that, when I try to change filters on this lens, the focus starts to go crazy because my hand is obstructing the image, causing the lens to rapidly focus and eventually overloading. I eventually was able to fix the issue by turning my camera on and off. Now, when the autofocus does work, the focus is fast and sticky. Like I mentioned before, the only situation where I really felt the lens was 100% on was when I was shooting in controlled environments with a single subject, like here in my YouTube office. That's where my next issue comes in. The autofocus is also just really loud and sounds like gears grinding. It is loud enough that your on-camera mic will pick it up. And even within 5 feet of this lens, you will hear it. Now, another thing to keep in mind for Sony users is that in order to preview the de-squeezed image with this lens, you will need a separate monitor. Even though the FX30 and the FX3 do have internal de-squeeze previews, this disables the autofocus function on the camera, forcing you to use manual focus. Now, this is definitely on Sony's side of things and will need an update, but in my opinion is a pretty big issue if you're trying to be compact and run and gun with an anamorphic lens. I personally think the price point of this lens should justify a better autofocus system. I think if they would have charged $300 to $500 more in order to include a linear autofocus system or just a much more advanced STM system, I 100% would have bought it. Okay, that was a lot. But here's my overall first impression and recommendation. I do like the overall image. It's a smooth look, and the transitions from in focus to out of focus are pleasing, and I'd be happy to use this lens on any of my future projects. I also think that there's no weird color cast or vignetting that happens, and even in full frame, I really like what's going on with the image of this lens, other than the weird shaped hexagon bokeh, which again, I can't decide whether or not I'm okay with. I do wish that Sirui would have spent a little bit more time implementing a stronger anamorphic characteristic to this lens, since it does lack a little bit in that category, but I think they spent a majority of their time focusing on the build quality of this lens, which was surprising. I think Sirui paid a ton of attention to the build and design of this lens, and it does look really, really nice. It feels really good in the hand. However, I don't think that the autofocus right now is reliable enough for a majority of situations. Even in landscape or wide shots, the lens struggles to decide what to focus on and does seem to have a little bit of a mind of its own, even using Sony's focus tracking. The autofocus is also just really loud enough that a mic on top of the camera would pick it up. And honestly, I found this surprising given that the Sirui sniper lenses and the Aurora lens were fairly quiet. The manual focus does work, and the Cinegear ring design is a fantastic basic edition, but with that STM motor, it is nothing like pulling focus on a cine lens. The autofocus issues could be due to my specific model, but as far as I'm aware, this is a production model and not a pre-production prototype. Now, I do believe that some of the autofocus issues could be solved in a future firmware update, and I chose not to contact Sirui about these issues until after posting this video in order to keep my opinions and experiences as honest as possible when testing this lens. With that being said, unless you're using this lens for talking head videos, interviews, or controlled environment situations that won't put too much strain on the autofocus, or if you're using a camera other than Sony, as I can't vouch for the performance of this lens on other systems, I don't think in good faith I can recommend buying this lens for its autofocus performance, at least until some of these issues could be resolved. Now, I'll do my best to keep you guys updated after talking with Sirui about these issues, either in the comments or in a future video. I honestly do hope to work with them as much as I possibly can to help improve the autofocus, and I hope that they take this video and my experience as constructive feedback and implement improvements rather than just ignore my thoughts, which in my experience is not like Sirui, so I do anticipate the future of these lenses being awesome, and I happily look forward to Sirui coming out with more of these autofocus lenses and maybe eventually getting us a whole set, as long as the autofocus works well. Like I mentioned before, this lens is the first of its kind, and hopefully is only going to get better from here. Now, if you do want to check out this lens for yourself, there is a link in the description, as well as a discount code for 5% off Sirui's website. It is an affiliate link, so if you do purchase from that link, it does support the channel. Thank you so much if you do. And if you enjoyed this video, maybe watch this video next, and don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that bell button so you never miss out on new young filmmaker content. Good luck filmmaking.